To begin talking about this particular chapter, we are looking at chapter 7. The total chapters are 12, so we're past the midpoint now. And to get into this area where she calls about what she calls white triggers, let me explain. She starts with this story. She was asked to do one-on-one mentoring. Now remember, this is a white author who has written this book, and she does these seminars, and so she's come up with a lot of experiences of what she's dealing with. And don't forget, I have had other conversations with members in the church, and I know that many of these folks are completely ignoring this process, and therefore my gut reaction to that is, well, where there is no willingness to explore, there's no willingness to change. And therefore, you cannot become part of the solution if you're not willing to consider these perspectives, these viewpoints. No one's asking anybody to swallow this hook, line, and sinker. But I am worried for the future of our society if we are unwilling to listen to people, even if we don't agree with them, if they don't come from our particular faith tradition, if they don't come from our political position, if you perceive them as radical conservative or radical liberal, I caution you that we will not learn, we will not grow, we will not consider what we can do to make things better. That's just my platform, and it does sadden me that it's kind of the state of affairs in our church, in our society, and in those places. So here's this one situation she got into where we had a white male teacher who had been charged. I mean, literally a complaint had been lodged against this person. He was charged with making inappropriate racial comments to a black female student. Now we got two issues going on, race and gender. And the girl's mother complained, and when that happened, the teacher, it hit a white trigger, is what this particular chapter is referred to. And so we'll call this teacher Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts became defensive and actually escalated the conflict, and this became a serious situation. So Mr. Roberts is the one who told me about this colleague in the discussions of his situation, that a white female teacher who recently had two black students at her desk, she referred to them as girl. I've been caught in this. I remember one time I was working in a choral situation with students, and it was a diverse choral situation over in the Athens and Gainesville area. We were trying to do some things with multiple churches, and I referred to the girls. I said, all right, the girls are going to do this. And one of the black choral directors immediately questioned my use of the word girls. We are not girls, she said. We are women, or we are ladies. It got one of those places where you feel like the PC police has jumped into the middle of your situation, and you've like, I can't ever say anything right anymore. I know I've heard you say that. I know you felt that way. And I got caught in this same thing. Being caught in those things, being found out in a sense of doing something that someone finds offensive, that's not really the problem. That's going to happen. That's going to happen a lot. The problem is the defensiveness that comes up with that, and we'll go back and explore some of the reactions that we have to this. But basically, the situation in this context that the teacher is talking about here, the author of this book, is that they perceived her intervention into this situation, which, by the way, complaints had been lodged. This thing was escalating, and it could have become a full-blown lawsuit at this school. And so they perceived that her intervention in this was a form of punishment for them. Another white trigger is that you have somehow belittled me, or you have chastised me in this role. And so it's really hard. I was embarrassed when the black choral director called me out for something that I did not perceive as being that way. It's not a matter of my perception. The matter is how she was perceiving it. So we have to be careful because we think, oh, you're just being oversensitive. All right, being called girl, or and even worse in the male perspective, to call a black person boy is perceived and should be considered a slur, a put down of sorts. So these white teachers, their response in this situation illustrate several dynamics of white fragility. Whereas all of us stand in the place of lacking some knowledge, lacking some context, that's where we should stand and where we should feel, oh, I'm not fully aware of what's going on here. I'm clueless in a sense. And to go further would make me not only clueless but insensitive to this. She's saying they had no curiosity about the student's perspective or why they were taking offense at this. They were just getting their triggers, their buttons pushed, so to speak. So this man, Mr. Roberts, despite a lack of cross-racial skills, a lack of understanding, he arrogantly remained confident that he was right and the student was wrong. So what happened between the two white teachers is that they maintained white solidarity with each other. Why, of course, you shouldn't feel this way. We shouldn't be attacked. We shouldn't be challenged. And they began to be very defensive about it. So they maintained white solidarity with each other, validating their shared perspective and invalidating that of the student of color. So what happens is this disequilibrium occurs. Suddenly I'm being challenged for what I've said or what I've done, and therefore they try to reestablish equilibrium in this case. And we're going to look back and see that these strategies are reflective. They're seldom conscious, but it doesn't make them benign. In fact, it can make them very troubling. And it, again, all this goes to is saying, are we going to be part of the problem or are we going to be part of the solution? A couple of other phrases that I've experienced in these last weeks are, I've worked very hard for what I got. I did not use white privilege at all. Those two statements are not mutually exclusive. A person can work very hard for what they've accomplished and yet still benefit from a white dominant society. That doesn't speak to racism in its worst cases, but it does speak to it in its more invisible cases. So we white people get very sensitive and we use the terms PC police, and I feel like everything I say is thrown back at me. I feel attacked at every turn. So let's drop our defensiveness, our anger, our emotions down just a little bit and look at the other perspective. We are insulated, she says. The larger social environment protects us as a group. And so if we dare move out of that dominance into a more willingness to improve, a willingness to see things in a different way, a willingness to move into a new reality, to step out of our area of safety, we have to be willing to expect a lack of racial comfort in our situations, become less, we have to be more tolerant of stress in our racial engagements. So here's some reasons why whites are so defensive, and we've come through this over the past few chapters. There are social taboos against talking openly about race. One of the phrases I heard in my conversations lately is that we just need to put the race card down. We don't need to use that anymore. That's not really an option. Can't really do that. If you're in the dominant group, you'd like to do that because you don't want to talk about race. But if you're in a racial minority, you can't really put race to the side. It's not realistic. Then we talk about the duality, or binary, she calls it, that the racist is bad person. I'm not a bad person, therefore I'm not racist. I'm good. Fear and resentment toward people of color. Delusion that we are objective individuals. We are not. We always speak out of a social context. Perhaps we live with a guilty knowledge there's more going on than we can or are willing to admit. We have a deep investment in a system that actually benefits us, and we've been conditioned to see it as a fair system. I worked hard for everything I've earned. Not denying that, but that does not mean that you didn't benefit. There's an internalized superiority or a sense of a right to rule. We got into a discussion at one point in the last few weeks of the definition of racism, that I think that others are less, and I don't think that. We live that, though. We live in a superior context, in a superior white society, and therefore it's there whether we admit it or not. There's a deep cultural legacy of anti-black resentment, and that plays into everything that we've been taught, everything we've experienced, watched, seen since the day we were, on our mama's knee. So white people have limited information about what racism is and how it works. If we don't accept that, we'll never grow, we'll never learn, we'll never move forward. We rarely use terms like white society. We would not use that term. We don't have to because we live in the dominant society. Over-advantaged. We would not consider ourselves over-advantaged. We consider ourselves as hardworking, and we've earned everything that we've received. Privileged. We hate that word. It's a trigger for us. Don't call me privileged. I'm not privileged. I grew up poor, or I grew up this, or I grew up that. You grew up white too, and we have to learn to face that reality. Race and its problems are what they have, not what we have. That's one of those issues that we have to confront in our lives. So there's a pressure from our society, there's a pressure from the management of whatever culture we're in, an academic culture, a religious culture, a business culture, to keep content comfortable and palatable for us whites. Don't talk about race. Don't bring up the race card. Common white responses to this is that we get angry or we withdraw. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to be around you anymore. I don't want to deal with this. Emotional incapacitation. I saw a video that this lady got into kind of a road rage with a black woman, and the woman followed her into a place and put the video on and said, "You called me the N-word out of your car window. And I want to talk." And the woman said, "I don't know what to do anymore." The white woman was melting down. An incapacitation she fell into because she was so overwhelmed with the confrontation from this black individual. A sense of guilt, augmentation, where we just blow everything out of proportion. I saw a cartoon on Facebook where a young white boy was having a gun poked at him or pointed to him. And the caption was, "Hey, we won't think about your situation anymore. Your situation won't be important anymore because only black lives matter." That's not what's being said. You're blowing that all out of proportion. You're augmentating. It has always been that white lives mattered, and it mattered greatly in the society and amongst the police force. I think what the women in Atlanta during the child murders was that they felt like that nobody really cared, that because it was black children, not white children. So we blow it up, we flip it, and we make it all about us. And there's a cognitive dissonance here where we don't really think clearly. We say to ourselves, I've already had a class on this. I already know this. I need to reduce the psychosocial stress that I'm living in because I frankly don't have the stamina for it. She says that she was a full adult, a parent, a college graduate before she had ever experienced a challenge to her racial identity or her racial position in society. So there's an expectation from us that we should be comfortable in our society and in our racial status. So she goes to this researcher, an anthropologist who likes to study how people behave and how we deal with society. And his name is Pierre Bourdieu, and he has a concept that he calls habitus, the habitus or habitat in which we live. Habitus is a result of socialization, the repetitive practices and actions that we live in and interactions with each other, and we come to expect it to be this way. Habitus can be thought of as a person's familiar ways of perceiving, of interpreting, and the ways we respond to the social cues around us. So habitus is part of three key aspects in this theory of white fragility that goes to Bourdieu's understanding of how humans behave. There is field, there is habitus, and there is capital. So let's look at each of these. Field, the social context in which we find ourselves. At a party? Is it a workplace? Is it a school? Is it a church? What is this? And so she takes school, for example, to talk about the microfields that we live and operate in. For instance, a microfield would be the teacher's lounge. How would you be in the teacher's lounge? Well, if you're a parent, you're going to be in a certain social standing. You're going to have certain capital in that situation. If you're a teacher in there, well, that's your room. If you're a student in the teacher's lounge, wow, you're in a whole different social context. What about the classroom? Same kind of thing. Are you the one in power there or not? How about on the playground? Well, that's where the students live and breathe, and so the teacher might find a little disequilibrium in that situation. What about the principal's office? Well, the teachers would not feel empowered there, neither would the parents, neither would the student. It would be more the staff, the administrators in that situation. What about in the nurse's office? What about at the janitor's supply room or where you are in their territory? So capital is that second aspect, is the social value that we hold in whatever particular field we find ourselves. Teacher, student, teacher, principal, popular girl with the unpopular girl, a custodian, receptionist, kindergarten teacher with a sixth grade teacher. Capital shifts with the fields that we find ourselves in. The custodian comes upstairs to speak to the receptionist. Then the custodian is on the receptionist's turf. But if the receptionist goes downstairs to get staples or pencils or toilet paper or paper towel, they are now in the supply room where the custodian has the more capital. So they want us to notice then how race, class, and gender are at play as well in these negotiations of power. What field we're in, what kind of capital we hold, whether we are white or black, whether we are upper class, middle class, whether we are male or female. It's complex, isn't it? How all this plays into habitus, a person's internalized awareness of his or her status, as well as how we respond to the status of others. Habitus will depend on the power position the person occupies within the social structure of that particular field. And that does shift. So I automatically shift into them as I enter each field, she says. These rules are explicitly taught to us, some of them. Some of the rules are unwritten. You just have to figure it out. And there's disequilibrium when we find ourselves in a habitus where our social cues are unfamiliar, or we find ourselves the majority. We're the white person in a room full of black people, or a room full of people of color, a diverse situation. You might feel that disequilibrium in that habitus. So habitus is not a result of free will, nor determined by structures, but created by the kind of interplay between human beings over time. Dispositions that are shaped by past events and experiences we've had, and structures. And it shapes the current practices and structures. So the white position can be challenged in these fields, these habitus that we find ourselves in, these particular fields and where we hold particular capital. A minimum amount of racial stress in the habitus becomes intolerable for us, triggering a range of defensive moves that we do. Emotion, anger, fear, guilt, behaviors, augmentation, blowing it out of proportion, silence, shutting down, or leaving the stress-inducing situation completely. I got to get out of here. I don't want to deal with this. I'm not coming back to this place. I don't want to drive through that neighborhood. Racial stress results from an interruption of the racially familiar for us. So there are a range of these interruptions take a variety of forms and come in a range of sources. For instance, we could experience a challenge to our objectivity, challenging my viewpoint, how I see things. Why are you taking offense at this? Well, they are. So let's talk about our objectivity there. A challenge to white taboos. Oh, we don't talk about those kind of things. Oh, don't bring that up. Ooh, it's not socially proper to talk about money, to talk about where we live, to talk about our status. We don't discuss those things. There's a challenge to white racial expectations, to talk about entitlement, to talk about our comfort with our position as the superior race, dominant race in a particular culture. So when people of color choose not to protect our white feelings, then we can see that as a challenge. We can see a challenge to our expectation that people of color will be nice. I want to do unto others as others would do unto me, so I expect them to do back to me the way I want to do unto them. You're speaking as an individual, though, not as a white person. White person dealing with a black person, there's a whole other range of things going on above that. And so we expect them to be nice. We expect them to be polite. People of color tell their stories, answer questions about their racial experience, and it makes us uncomfortable. A challenge to white solidarity. How does it feel when someone who is of your race challenges you on where you are? That's a challenge to our solidarity together. Why are you saying this? Why are you being this way? We're supposed to be on the same side. A challenge to white innocence, our racial innocence. In other words, our behavior has a racial impact, and you've got to become aware of it whether you want to or not. Individualism, again, I'm saying that we want to act as individuals, not as a race, but you can't do that. You are a race. You are white. So you've got to incorporate that into the larger social structure in which you live. A challenge to meritocracy. Now let me see if I can explain meritocracy. That access to opportunity is unequal between racial groups. That we would go into a situation and be much more comfortable in it than would a person of color, or vice versa. We would go into a situation that we would find very uncomfortable, where we're the minority in that situation. All right, meritocracy. A challenge to white authority. Be presented by a person of color or a person of different gender in a position of authority over us. Can we show deference there? The capital has changed. I've lost capital, they've gained it, and my habitus is no longer familiar and comfortable for me. A challenge to white centrality, being presented with information about other racial groups through movies where people of color drive the action but are not stereotypical in their roles, or going through multicultural education where we're considered the ones who need to learn something. And then the challenge to universalism, suggesting that my perspective is not representative of all humanity, that there's a world of people out there who are not living our experience. Isn't that interesting? So how do we respond constructively? And then she told the story about the situation where the people overreact, or they react out of these different constructs where you start accusing the PC police, or you start escalating the situation by being defensive. I think at the very form of this, they're just saying, can you be teachable? Can you be humble? Can you be less defensive and more understanding, being willing to think, oh, am I not seeing this a certain way, rather than being upset about it? And I know it feeds into our emotions. But again, what is the challenge here? The challenge is to ask white people to be part of the solution, to help make change. I can't do anything about how a person of color is going to come into this situation. I can only deal with my responses as how I'm going to make things better. So let's be a little more aware of our habitus that we live in, the fields that we occupy, and the capital that we carry into those fields with us, okay?